Let's do it.
Let's see what happens here. Everyone, this is the Dark Journalist Show. It's X Series special report, Cayce Nostradamus Ultimate Prophecy Revealed. And I'm here with the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I am a DJ. I am what I play. Can't turn around. No, can't turn around.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because I've been working on a documentary going deep on the Roswell front on one side. And then we did the Alex Jones show yesterday, which was a blast. I did the third hour of his show. I hosted it. And we had a great time with all that. We actually went deep on the Iran issue. And it's interesting because Alex had done a number of things. Okay, that's enough of that. Alex had done a number of things to keep, the focus on not the rush over the waterfall there to war with Iran, which is very important. I can't tell you how important it is when we have a major voice out there like Alex putting that on the record, because there's so many of these types and the kind of Fox News types going over the waterfall trying to get us into a war with Iran, which we didn't start, which Israel started by lobbing bombs over there. And there are sensitive negotiations between the United States and Iran over the nuclear issue. So this is, this is pretty substantial, what we're looking at with all of it. What I would say is that one of the things to keep in mind, perhaps, is that it is one of the most important pieces of the Iran deal is to get them to stop, creating this. But I have reports now, and I'm going to read you something from tonight that goes back to 2010. That is all about, Iran might get a nuke. We have to bomb them. Israel's pressuring us. So it's been going on for a long time. Of course, we've had rogue states develop nuclear devices before. You only have to go as far as North Korea, for example. And we have it in the case of India and Pakistan, where they, kind of threaten each other that they're going to go nuclear and all the rest of it. And one of the trickiest things about the current crisis was hearing from the Trump administration saying, well, everything's on the table, including tactical nukes. Now, tactical nukes are this new breed of nuclear bomb that's supposed to be smaller, and you can just use it in a little place and boom, but they're still as dangerous as ever. And, there's no reason to invest in them, and tactical nukes should not be on the table for anything. So what you have is a situation very similar, actually, to the Cuban Missile Crisis in a number of ways. And one of the ways that President Kennedy was able to navigate such a difficult situation, in that case of the Russians putting missiles in his backyard, our backyard here of Cuba. And what happened was Kennedy was instantly pressured by the Joint Chiefs to just bomb Cuba and take the missiles out. But there were all kinds of sensitive issues, like if we did that, you're going to kill a lot of Russians and Cubans, and you also could spread that into a world war, and that would be a shooting war of a nuclear style. So you could fry all of humanity. And so Kennedy was very aware of the perilous situation that the world had stumbled into through the reckless action of Khrushchev. And he very narrowly went through all of the different options. And what he figured out was that an embargo could be placed on ships coming in delivering more missile parts and more of the machinery that would make it possible to launch those weapons. And he did, in fact, put together a quarantine of the island of Cuba. And even though the Russians went crazy and said, you can't do that, they were the ones who had lied in the first place. Kennedy then took the U-2 photos that he had taken and had his U-2 flights going over Cuba and showing the missile sites. And he took those pictures and he put Adlai Stevenson before the UN to present them to a waiting public, to prove to the world that the Russians had placed nuclear weapons into Cuba in order to get the right amount of support to get the weapons out, as opposed to the bombing run that he was being pressured to by the deep state, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, and all the hawks who wanted this showdown. And they wanted Cuba back as well after they had lost it, through Castro overthrowing Batista. And it's a very unusual situation because the amount of pressure, it was kind of inevitable. Everyone knew that there was going to be some kind of nuclear exchange going on. And the navigation of the issue by President Kennedy was so deft and was so well managed. It came from a lifetime of consideration of statecraft, of how you would handle yourself in the ultimate crisis situation. You know, in the Star Trek mythology, they have a Kobayashi Maru, which is the ultimate scenario of how would you deal with a crisis. And in this case, what Kennedy decided to do was not go in there guns blazing and just say, we have American might, we're going to take it out, you'll be a parking lot, all that kind of stuff. He took all that rhetoric off the table and he said, you, the Russians, are doing this reckless, clandestine endeavor. We're going to get all of our allies in the Western Hemisphere to get together and do this, and I'm going to show them this secret intel. Now, what's missing is the statecraft on the Trump side. This is the major problem, and it's part of what I try to get across yesterday on Alex's show. Here's the crucial thing. If you have intel that the Iranians have the capability and are that close or actually have a nuclear bomb, then you have to show it to the public before you do anything. So the Israelis decided, oh, hey, you know, we can get you involved in this. We'll bomb the hell out of them, and then they'll fire some missiles at us, and then you're automatically obligated to defend us. You know, that's a big mistake even for an ally to make, and our answer to them should be, it's your shooting war, you take care of it, if that's what your objective is. Our objective on behalf of the United States is that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, you know. So, you know, like it or not, that's the policy. But unless you have proof that they have a nuclear weapon or they're in that stage and that you're bombing just the facility, you're doing surgical strikes on the facility, then that's a totally different matter completely. But the way that it's being handled is just all-out war, and the nuclear thing is just kind of the excuse to get involved with it. So it's a very, very major, major issue and could get us all into World War III because, of course, Russia backs Iran and Pakistan backs Iran. And so Israel, by just sort of, you know, doing this shoot from the hip thing, they've had this plan on the shelf, as we know, since the late 1990s. They just have wanted to go for it. And the American administrations have said, no, you know, we're not willing to commit ourselves to that. The last time we committed ourselves to a situation like that, it was 10 years in Iraq. And the only people who did well were the oil companies and the arms manufacturers and the defense contractors. The citizens there didn't do any better. And certainly American citizens and the soldiers that went to fight didn't do any better. So this is the nature of the thing. We've walked down this before, and Trump is the ultimate person not to take the bait on this, and yet we've seen him lean in the direction of taking the bait. So what needs to happen, and I think it's good on the independent media side, is there was a big pushback, especially among Trump supporters on this, and I think it caught the White House by surprise, and they reconsidered the kind of drastic nature of the language and all the rest. Something needs to be introduced in that Trump White House that has a lot of statecraft, a lot of diplomacy. I don't know where it's going to come from. You know, I originally thought they were going to do it with Vance because he's kind of like, you know, the honor student you can use in the background. But they're trying to make Vance now sound like Trump so that he, you know, he calls world leaders morons or whatever. You know, this doesn't make sense. He's more like the Richie Cunningham hanging out in the back. And so what we need to do is take a situation like that and take the temperature down and try to tell Israel and Iran as part of negotiations to stop firing at each other. And if Israel thought, hey, you know, we're going to shoot at their nuclear sites, it doesn't look to me, you know, it just looks to me like they were firing on Iran. I don't see that they've done a lot of damage to Iran's nuclear program. So if Iran wants to have a nuclear bomb and we don't want them to have one, then that's one issue. But to just lure us in on the timing that isn't our own, or it doesn't identify with our own self-interest as a nation, is a terrible, terrible foreign policy mistake and has to be avoided at all costs. So Iran, I think the situation in Iran and bombing Iran, whenever you get around that, it's very dangerous. Tonight, what we're going to do is, aside from the deep state politic of the whole thing, we're going to look at it from a mystical point of view. And there are a lot of mystery school predictions about the Middle East, Iran, Americans' actions, and some of the perilous possibilities involved in that, and also how some of the destiny that's lined up for that needs to be avoided, creating a different timeline to get through a lot of this tension. And I think some of those timelines have been avoided, in fact, because I think right there with the September 2001 piece, there was part of this was in play, and with the decade of terror that followed, part of this was in play. So you've seen different options and different things happening. All the way back, of course, to Nostradamus as a major student of the mystery schools, through Cagliostro and Saint Germain, all of these different figures showing up in history at pivotal times, giving this kind of very clear indication of a group working in the background to move the civilization forward, to move society in a good direction. And that explodes, of course, into the wonderful mystery school, mystery schools of theosophy, Steiner's anthroposophy, and ultimately the Gurdjieff work, the Cayce work. And of course, the Cayce work outlining so well what we have going on here in the 21st century. All of that was laid out there to give us some foundation from the mystical side and brought it into culture as ideas. So we've seen it for years as specials of this. They've exploited like specials on Nostradamus, and they've made Cayce a prophet of doom and all that stuff. It doesn't matter, because at the core of it is a message, something being sent across all of those different divides. That's what we're going to get into tonight. And you're going to be very surprised about some of the Nostradamus quatrains, those 4-line poems in those wonderful predictions that he made that applied directly, and I mean directly, to this period that we're in. We're going to get into all that tonight, and we'll see if everything goes smoothly. We'll take some questions on the end of the broadcast as well, but we're going to go about 90 minutes on this special report tonight, and I also have some updates for you on the Roswell research as well. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, how's your everything out there?
Well, the vibe is very passionate. Number one,
Yeah,
I would say Anne Morel says, "Oh, hell yes, this is just the diversion I need from the craziness of the world." And Pulp Buzz says, "Ooh, the blue turban." Kelzilla says, "Blue turban intrigue, I want to know."
Yes.
And Thomas Ball says, "I knew we were screwed when they brought back Tom Cruise for Top Gun, and it was about an Iranian airstrike."
Oh yeah, they rolled out a lot. Remember, Thomas Crooks was supposedly an Iranian assassin. Remember that?
I forgot that.
And they pulled that. And I'll tell you what wasn't so hot about, we all know this Dan Bongino guy, who's the Secret Service guy, and then he was a Fox commentator and had his own show and stuff. And then he got chosen to be the number 2 man at FBI. And he's an interesting guy. I think he has a lot to offer, but it was weird. Both Patel and Bongino, I mentioned this on InfoWars yesterday, but both of them have been a little odd around some key issues, and I think people have noticed. But one of them was that they didn't seem to want to investigate into Thomas Matthew Crooks, who was the attempted assassin of President Trump back there in July, and then, of course, was taken out himself on this roof that was only about 100 yards from the president, which was absurd. And, of course, we had COG involvement right there in the middle of all this. And that was through the director of the Secret Service at the time, who was actually, she was the same agent who had pulled Vice President Cheney into the COG bunker during the 9/11 attacks. So we had that incredible overlap. And then the stories that came out of that whole assassination attempt, we were supposed to fly a drone, but our drone wasn't working, all this nonsense. And of course, the crowd is pointing at the guy climbing up the building. But it's interesting, if you listen to the police reports, they have this individual they call Flatface. And Flatface looks exactly like Crooks, and he's heading in the opposite direction while the other guy's on the roof. So they're following him. They're tracking 2 people. And so there's a number of unusual things. There's doppelgangers, and there's also the fact of, this guy up there getting a shot like that. He came that close. He actually nicked the ear of the president. The whole thing is a complete Secret Service disgrace, needs to be investigated. And so how a guy like Bongino and Patel couldn't put that across is absurd to me. But then you might remember that Bongino as well was talking about, you know, Iranian terrorists wanting to assassinate Trump. This kind of rhetoric before all this is back in, you know, January. So there were some of these disturbing trends that were going on out there, and that the drones, you know, when the drones were happening, which were a complete device of NORTHCOM and these private industry like Anduril drone dealers to see the response to a sky event on the ground and collect that data, do the data mining on it. That happened extensively in December, and it literally was the buildup for a UFO threat. You know, they got a lot of details there about how people would feel and how they would respond, what kind of panic would ensue, and all the rest of it. So we got a great little, you know, dose of that, just like when the Chinese balloon came across in 2023. Very unusual, very, very unusual, along with the fact that the COG combatant commander, who was also the NORTHCOM and NORAD commander, in this case, General Gio now, coming forward in these different situations and, you know, giving us these like, oh, we don't know if it was a UFO, you know, and the New York Times touting headlines like UFO shoot down. They were trying, they were amping up this UFO threat through the COG process. And, you know, I make the point that NORTHCOM got involved in the riots in Los Angeles. This is also quite interesting, in my opinion. I'll get into that tonight as we go deep into what's going on here with this war footing. Tonight, though, it's the dark journalist X special report, Cayce Nostradamus, the mystery school prophecies. That includes RUDOLF STEINER's. I have some of his with me tonight, too, that are quite fascinating. And the blue turban is deep in this episode as well. Before I go any further, what do you got?
There's a lot of passionate opinions.
Yeah.
And I just want everybody to take the temperature down, right? We're here to learn.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you about a weird trend that's been going on before we dive deep into everything. Now, I've mentioned this before about these CIA personnel dressing themselves up as UFO whistleblowers. It's a total joke, and it's being unmasked. And it's finally, you know, major publications like the Wall Street Journal are starting to pull the plug on the whole Elizondo Mellon charade. It's very interesting, though, because what they're trying to do is put the genie back in the bottle on the Wall Street Journal side and say, oh, there are no UFOs. It was all just a military hoax, you know, which is complete nonsense. But the CIA false threat program, that thing is falling on its face. It was launched heavily in 2017, the end of 2017, by the New York Times, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, and the TTSA. We've spent all this time calling it out. Jim Semivan, of course, the top CIA directorate guy running the whole thing, being at the top of the organization doing this. So all those people have been tried. They've been budgeted billions of dollars to do this, and they've created a UFO defense office that's connected to the National Defense Authorization Act, ARROW. But now it seems like the data that they've been getting back is they need to kind of scrap that effort, and there's something else that's going to move in. In the middle of all this, I think what they're trying to do is promote this John Ramirez character, CIA agent, who claims now that he was in touch with these beings. These beings came to him. Now, this is the new thing that the CIA is doing, as if we would believe their version of an abductee experience as CIA agents, when, you know, they have their own program for creating these, of course. But Ramirez has been going off the rails lately, talking about, oh, you know, there's this big event coming in 2027, and, you know, I was told by a hooded figure, you know, I mean, real nonsense. So, and of course, that whole field of independent media promoting this guy and his CIA thing. Look, we don't need CIA people for UFO disclosure. How clear is it after 7 years of them completely giving you BS upon BS, intel agent after intel agent? How many more intel agents are going to walk across the catwalk on this? You know, you're going to get to the same BS level as Elizondo, who now, as his last ditch attempt, is sending around, you know, what look like kind of weird mutant dolls or whatever and pretending that they're alien pictures. Are you kidding me? So, there's something very strange about all this, but the headlines that they have going on, ex-CIA officer confirms alien hybrids exist. This is the new thing that they're coming through with, which is, and they pick up on all the different lore in the genuine UFO community about hybrids, the psychic side, and all the rest of it. So this is a very dangerous game that they're playing, but they need to, they try to come in with the psionic thing, which was the psychic link. And remember, their whole thing was about a UFO threat. It was all militaristic and all the rest of it. They had the congressional hearings and, they had Grush and all of the things that he had to say. But then I found out that Grush was under the thumb of Chris Mellon. That didn't play too well. And the whole UFO world, they didn't want anything to do with real research. They didn't want anything to do with anything. So this is the nature of that field. It is just a podcast pop click field. It has no foundation. So now this is an opportunity, and it's interesting that a mainstream publication stepped in to shake out the false version of it. But what they're trying to do is kind of bottle it up completely. I'm going to read a couple of things off of that. But the first thing I want to put across to you on that is the Ramirez thing, throw it out the window, because it's another CIA person coming along with a story, pretending to be an inside whistleblower and all that stuff. And let me tell you, if that was a real CIA program,
he'd be arrested. He'd be in Guantanamo or some black site.
There's no question about it. So, it's a very simple formula. If it says CIA or counterintel agent on the top of it, scrap it. Go for civilian investigators. If you have some military or intelligence defectors, you can talk to them and incorporate it into the thing. But they can't be the lead people because they're all responding to the same group. And then they get together and make movies and have book deals. And they're funded to the hilt by the intelligence agencies who want a UFO threat sky event because they can do a number of things with that, including call emergency powers. And that's part of the danger that we're looking at in the Iran situation as well. But let's see here. Here's the article. Now, part 2 is coming out. The Pentagon disinformation that fueled America's UFO mythology. Okay. This is the article that came out. And these guys were going into details on it. And again, they ran across a program that was under the blue designation. And here's the thing. In 2023, in March, we released information about the blue UFO program inside the government. In the fall of that year, we did a whole documentary. I did it with Kelsey Forrest, and it's a 2-hour mega dose on blue, the UFO program inside the government. There's no information anywhere about it anywhere at that time. March of 2024, they put out all the information about Kona Blue. And the government's like, yeah, we had a, UFO retrieval program, but we never found anything. So don't even worry about it and forget about blue. But they admitted that they had it because since we were putting it on the record, what were they going to do? And that was the time when I was putting it out, when I was hearing from all these counterintel agents who were like, yeah, it's great to talk to you. We watch your show and, hey, it's really interesting. How'd you get that name Blue? How'd you figure that one out? Well, I'm not going to tell you. So that went on for a little while. Now we have released in a major publication, the Wall Street Journal, the program Yankee Blue, which is also a UFO hazing program that they do with these new whistleblowers. And they show them images of UFOs and pretend that they're inside on the inside. They're in with the in crowd, and they're doing this whole bit with Yankee Blue. So there's the other piece of the blue as well. We released it all in early 2023. They've come out with it in 2024, 2025. So these guys are catching up, but we were ahead of the pack on this. The reason I put that across is when we give you information related to the UFO file, it's coming from a deep arc of research. And I only go for the most potent, the most credible stuff. When you go and you're buying vitamins or you're buying multivitamins and that whole thing in nutrition, and you see the thing that says high potency, right? High potency, that's what this show is all about. That's the kind of thing, that's the research I'm interested in. And most of the stuff that lays around and passes itself off in independent media doesn't work that way for one reason or another. And, everyone has their own research track. That's the way it goes. But there's a lot of exploitation in the field. And this is what I think needs to be addressed. And, we're often bringing it up, but I want to raise it just for a moment because it's on overdrive. There's a thing out there called peak metric that I've discovered, which is these podcasters just grabbing these issues that they don't know anything about, brushing headlines out, grabbing CIA people to be the stars of their thing. And that's not alternative media. That's not what independent media was supposed to be, a complete contrast to the mainstream media, which was bought and paid for and had all the influence of state media. Well, what happened is those guys started to get unpopular, and there was a real independent movement that was making them unpopular. And then they were like, well, they threw their hands up and they were like, yeah, we'll just invest in AstroTurf into that independent space. So now you have all these things that are just funded by the same people doing the same things. So you're going to need a third avenue for all this, a totally third direction. So you've got regular corporate media, which is paid media, and now you have their version of paid media into the independent media. That's not going to work. We need to call that out too and create a third version in all this. One of the things is that I wanted to mention here in the article, comes off, it's got this kind of cynical UFO thing like, oh, there are no UFOs, don't worry about it. So remember, the X-Protect thing is total secrecy. So if you can't take over an issue, you'll try to put it back in the bottle. That's not going to work either. And so it's a very interesting schizophrenic situation between the media on this and the deeper forces in the CIA who are trying to run the CIA UFO threat op. There's a secrecy piece that's like, if we can co-opt it, great. We'll roll it out there as a false UFO threat. But there's another piece in the middle of all this that's also saying, well, if we can just kind of keep up with these whistleblowers and stuff, we'll break the dam. And so there's a couple of interesting quotes in there. I'll read a couple. Many pilot accounts of floating orbs were actually reflections from the sun from Starlink satellites, investigators found. They're still examining whether some unexplained events could be foreign technology, such as Chinese aircraft. Well, maybe it's a weather balloon and you're back in Roswell in 1943. So they're using very old-fashioned excuses. So that's not going to fly either. So the debunking won't fly, and the UFO threat also has issues. So what they're trying right up the middle is this weird Ramirez thing of a CIA guy getting abducted and this hooded figure giving him intel about an invasion in 2027. I kid you not. But I did want to mention the thing about Yankee Blue. Let's see here. Oh, yeah, they try to also pass off the nuclear interest of UFOs as just tests that we're doing on our own bases. Hey, yeah, sure. So you go into like almost launch capability. And by the way, it's not just the United States that experiences UFOs over their nuclear bases. The Soviet Union had it, of course. Classically, Russia has it now. China, they show a great amount of interest, and there's a lot of different reasons for that, but it has nothing to do with just being tested and, oh, it's just a military thing, whatever. So you can see that they're coming down on too skeptical of a position on that. But it is interesting that the CIA clown factor is getting booted off the stage a little bit. So what you need to watch for in the crisscross is them rolling out more CIA people with wilder and wilder stories, right? I'm in love with an egg. I'm in love with the space egg. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, going deep, deep tonight into the very, very interesting mystery school prophecies that relate to Iran or Greater Persia, Greater Arabia, as our friend Nostradamus would say. We'll take your questions in the second half of tonight's program. And we're coming off doing the Alex Jones show yesterday. We're shooting this Roswell documentary for you, which is very important. I've got a whole series now, Roswell Reignited, about important new information relating directly to the Roswell event. We just did an interview with Joseph Farrell, and part 2 of that interview, we did a whole Roswell Reignited section of that, trying to get his views on some of the powerful things we found out in relation to the Foster Ranch and some of the groups that were operating there, and how there's a huge intersection in history between the JFK assassination and the Roswell incident, 16 years apart, but the same people involved in the very, very heart of it. So this is an explosion in that whole field. So hopefully, unless we have World War III, we'll get somewhere
Mm.
with this summer with all that. I want to read a couple of the most intriguing Nostradamus pieces that relate directly to some of the tensions that we're seeing in the Middle East and its possibility for setting off World War III. And like I said, we'll go about 90 minutes with you here tonight in the special report, and we'll take your questions in the last half hour. So how does that sound?
Sounds great.
And it looks like our sound is all set. I don't know what that was for the first 3 minutes.
You're slightly
there.
off sync, but we're going to deal with it.
Off sync. That's interesting.
Mhm. Nothing can be done about it now.
I would say this, that it strikes me that perhaps there's something a little deeper going on. All right, let's do this. You've seen all those books and specials and movies and everything else about Nostradamus and all the wild predictions, and they squeezed that whole base of knowledge heavy and hard. But if you go deep into Nostradamus, here's what you're going to find. 1, he was a mystery school student of the highest order. 2, he was a brilliant writer. 3, he was a brilliant astrologer. 4, he was a physician. And 5, he was a great humanitarian trying to help with the plague in the era that he was living in there in the 60s.
And he did. He was very
century.
Successful at it.
He was, yeah.
Mhm.
He created all these,
Using herbs and essential oils.
Yeah, he did a whole apothecary thing.
Mhm.
As a lot of those very interesting Renaissance men did in that period. They were alchemists, they were philosophers, they were musicians, they were poets. And, one thing didn't cancel out the other. They were just a real Renaissance character. One of the things that stood out in all of what he had to say, and no one could really figure out what he was getting at, was this figure in a blue turban who he identified as a third Antichrist. And that this was the period, that we were looking at, and that he was coming out of Greater Arabia. I'm going to read his actual quote. And this is the picture of the Orson Welles really fascinating documentary, really the best documentary on Nostradamus, no question. But this is the figure and the way they depicted him with the blue turban in there. And here's what Nostradamus had to say. And this is the traditional Nostradamus from his Prophecies book, where he has all of these quatrain 4-line poems in this century style. So there's 100 of them.
Along those
Wait,
lines.
no, let me read it.
Okay.
Let me read it, and then we'll get to it.
Okay.
Can you hold it?
I can hold
Yes.
it.
Out of the country of Greater Arabia shall be born a strong master of Muhammad. He will enter Europe wearing a blue turban. He will be the terror of mankind. Never more horror. His war will last 27 years. And by the way, he projects him directly into this 21st century and calls him the king of, he will bring back the life to the king of the Mongols. And I want you to keep in mind the Mongols thing, because the Mongols thing shows up in the Cayce work, it shows up in the STEINER work, and here we are in the 1500s with Nostradamus talking about it. Something very, very important about that. The war will last 27 years. The sky will burn at 45 degrees as fire approaches the great new city. So there are all these interpretations. Well, this is a nuclear attack on New York City launched by this, incredible leader out of Greater Arabia, which, would include Persia, and that's Iran. When those of the northern pole are united, in the east will be great fear and dread. One day the two great leaders will be friends. Their powers will be seen to grow. The new land will be at the height of its powers. And then there's a reference that comes along with this to a character named Mabus, M-A-B-U-S. Now, It's very interesting to me because there's what I call a literary hit job on the Mavis character, where for years they've been trying to say, oh, that was just an artist that was around in the period of Nostradamus. He's not talking about the Antichrist. Don't, you know, don't mention that. Don't say that Mavis is the name of the Antichrist. If you go into the literature, it looks like he's describing Mavis, the name, directly as the Antichrist. So I don't know where that whole wave of literature comes from, but I've seen it happen in a number of different things, which is the revisionist history that happens around certain UFO cases. Like, for example, the Lonnie Zamora case is one of the best cases because it's a policeman and he sees a UFO land and sees these figures get out. Then other policemen join him and they see it, and then they see, the different things of the craft, and then he has pictures of the craft. It is a rock solid case there in New Mexico. And what they tried to do very flimsily was say it was a prank by some college kids and all this. This is a trained police officer. There's a UFO landing on a highway and beings coming out. Okay, that's not the kind of thing that you can fake as a college prank. And they come in with this later revisionism to get you off the important things. Have you ever heard that, oh, the Roswell thing, that's just something that the government cooked up? Look, the government didn't want the story out. That's the whole point. That's why from 1947 to 1979, there's not one mention of it anywhere. So we need to get clear about the false revisionism versus, what would be a kind of ordinary debunking. There's targeted, very strange literary movements, and that is to prevent the kind of spread of information around that. So what we have here is Nostradamus coming in and saying there's a figure in a blue turban who identifies on a few different occasions, by the way. It's not a one-off mention. And that he's out of a country, the country of Greater Arabia. That would include Iran in this case. And he's a strong master of Muhammad. And he says he will enter Europe wearing a blue turban, and he will be the terror of mankind, never more horror. Now, certainly nuclear weapons, exotic weapons, things of this nature would create a scenario like what he's discussing here. So I think that this is put across and laid out for us. And then there's the mention of bringing back to life the king of the Mongols before and after war reigns. And the Mongols thing is interesting because if you're a student of the Cayce readings, you're going to find Cayce talking about this and saying, if America fails in this period in the 21st century, that must the Mongols, most a hated people, be raised. It's a very unusual, obscure thing. In Steiner's work, he says, well, if civilization doesn't blossom, in America the way that it should, civilization will move to China, the point, the apex of civilization. And, we could see that with the way that the Chinese antics and their government and the repression of speech and all that wouldn't be a very good move for humanity. So I suggest the United States take up the challenge and really fulfill its role here. There's that obscure, strange thing about the when those of the Northern Pole are united, somehow that helps. And there have been some Nostradamus people who read it as, well, that's the Arctic, and that's, the Americans and the Russians kind of crisscross there. I don't know. I still wonder about that, frankly. And I'm going to give you some other readings that are going to suggest that maybe that there might be something related to Canada in the middle of all this. And that could be where all the hubbub about Canada happened at the beginning of the Trump administration. So now a kind of a summation based on the documentary on Nostradamus says this: a king of terror wearing a blue turban, described as the terror of mankind, will rise to power in Greater Arabia, wage war around the world, and spread the influence of Islamic fundamentalism. Nostradamus claims that the king of terror would form an alliance with Russia. Now, this is interesting because we do have this incredible tight peace between Russia and Iran in the background. And although Russia hasn't done anything to intervene, you can see they're right there. I mean, Iran is literally connected to Russia, and they have a long-standing situation with each other. It's not going to go unnoticed if we start, our own bombing campaign over there. So Russia today, after standing aside this whole time, suddenly comes out of the blue and says, you know what? You guys, you can't, the Israelis and Americans have to stop what's going on here. Okay. So keep in mind the King of Terror, the Blue Turban, and this rhetoric, and Persia, and all the rest of it. It's modern day Iran. So some other quatrains that aren't talked about very often in the Nostradamus work, I picked up on, and they just came to me as I was looking at them. And I found out something. If you go through the quatrains, by the way, you won't need drugs, okay? But they're going to put you in a very strange state. And if you read into them deeply, they start to kind of communicate. And some people have said they've had that experience with the I Ching, and I believe it. But there's something locked into the language. You find that in the Gurdjieff work as well. Try reading Beelzebub's Tales. Sober. Here's a few that struck me as being particularly on the money, and I'm going to show you maybe some things even that have been missed. The great star will burn for 7 days. This is, again, projecting into this period of this so-called Antichrist, the Blue Turban. The great star will burn for 7 days. The cloud will cause 2 suns to appear. The big mastiff will howl all night, when the great pontiff will change country. Now, we had the first American pope after the death of Pope Francis just recently. And, him coming from America is a change of country, certainly. And the pontiff being the representative there. And of course, there have been all these reports about 2 suns, and a lot of, certainly a lot of things are a trick of light or CGI or AI or whatever. But this has been going on. I've been aware of it since at least 2005, 2006, this thing about 2 suns. And I remember a number of photographs coming over from China where people were saying, hey, in this one particular village, we were seeing 2 suns. Now, I went back and found a story from NBC News. And it says 2 suns spotted in China. This is from 2011. 2 suns spotted in China defy explanation. Weeks after a story shot across the web claiming that the imminent explosion of a nearby star would result in the appearance of a second sun in the sky, a story that was later debunked, but 2 suns were caught on camera yesterday in China. You couldn't get around this story. I think it's quite significant for a lot of reasons, because we have the whole thing about the Dimming the Sun program going on through Bill Gates in the UK, and the UK now moving forward with it. So something about the sun in relation to this, and there's a warning here sitting in the heart of Nostradamus's work, where he says the great star will burn for 7 days. The cloud will cause 2 suns to appear, which is pretty unusual, I think, for his period to be thinking, 2 suns will appear in the sky. I don't think that was a very common thing in, the 1500s. Then now in these quatrains, the same one, this is century 2. So that was 41. Okay, that quatrain, the one about the great star. This is number 62. Mavis then will soon die. There will come of people and beasts a horrible rout. Then suddenly one will see vengeance. 100-hand thirst, hunger, and the comet will run. And, there was a whole thing around Halley's Comet when people were freaking out. That's what Nostradamus was talking about. And yet this idea about the comet running, along with the whole thing about sunspots and everything else that's been going on, may lead us to this idea that there's some awareness about a sky event that's going to take place. So I thought that in association with, Mavis has a kind of a reign here during a period of time. And then, he goes down, and it's associated with this comment. Now, here's the unusual thing, and I put this up on Twitter X with a picture of Trump and the Iranian flag. And this is number 67 now in Century 2, and it says, "The blonde one will come to compromise the fork-nosed one through the duel and will chase him out. The exiles within he will have restored, committing the strongest to the marine places." And again, all of these quatrains, in my opinion, relate directly to the period that we're in. And I think the blonde one is a pretty good name, possibly, if you're identifying Trump. And I think what he's saying here is Trump is going to end up on the national stage in a huge clash with a major leader on that side, representing the kind of Middle Eastern interests. Here's the next one. It's number 70. "The dart from the sky will make its extension. Death's speaking, great execution. The stone in the tree, the proud nation restored. Horrible noise, human monster." This one grabbed me again, because again, in the 15th century, human monster, we haven't heard about Frankenstein. It's not in the popular culture. So here he is scrying and looking through that future, and human monster comes out. Purge, expiation. So the human monster thing, along with the cloning aspect, is quite fascinating, because I'm going to read you something about cloning tonight, which might open up some of the things in relation to the UFO file. And here again is a mention of the blue turban, where he says, "The blue turban king will enter into Foy. He will reign less than an evolution of Saturn. The white turban king, King Byzantium, heart banished, Sun, Mars, Mercury near Aquarius." Now, there's no question there's a number of astrologers who are familiar with and study Nostradamus, but I can't help but think, given the focus around the particular era that we're in, that somebody might want to take a new look at some of the things that he's talking about here in relation to this. The other thing is, there's the blue turban king entering this part of southwestern France. I think that is also significant. For example, if we start to see activity between Iran and France around this, then you could be, again, looking at some of the things that Nostradamus is giving us in this period, and he's really bringing it across that there's some figure here who holds the reins of humanity and the kind of terror for humanity in his hands. Now, what's also interesting, of course, is that Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian mystic, so deep in the shows that we do here, he brought forward this idea that the whole Ahrimanic thing was coming directly through the technology in the 21st century. And Ahriman being the evil, the embodiment of evil in Persian mythology, we have Iran again coming in through different ways, through different sides. So I think that Iran, it comes up again in the Rata story in the Cayce readings as a potential early location for the Garden of Eden, believe it or not. So there's a lot at play when we get around Iran. For example, can you imagine, a nuclear exchange taking place in the Garden of Eden? So there's a deeper background to this. Of course, geopolitically, there's a deeper thing. I've been reading about Iran for years, and they had all these incredible troubles. They had the Iranian Revolution, all the stuff that took place, even before I was born. But you're always aware of this kind of echo, and there's some tension there. There's something about Iran over and over again. And, we had that whole history with Iraq, and we had the invasion with Iraq. And of course, we funded Iraq. We sent Rumsfeld over with bags of money for Saddam to fight Iran. And, he used chemical weapons on the Iranians. There's all kinds of terrible things there. But I want to say this in relation to the people that are guiding the thought of President Trump as well in relation to Iran, which is, Iran is no paper tiger country. I mean, you're talking about 90 some odd million people, a large landmass, and much more infrastructure than anything that Iraq has, and a much more developed army and all the rest of it. So anything that's done in relation to Iran has to include the most careful thought, with the idea of leading with a peaceful overture, regardless of the tensions going on in relation to Israel and all this. And the Israel part is a whole separate piece of it. Israel's an ally of ours, and there's a whole there's so many things about Israel and Gaza and all that. Can't get into that just in this episode, but I will say this, that the idea of Israel at this juncture, where their leadership is weakened, dragging the United States into a war to kind of save the regime, is a real that's a real situation to avoid. It's an ultimate loser for the United States, and it comes with a trail of destruction and distraction and economic ruin. And I would say, just imagine the lives of people in Iran. And if you look at surveys and people who observe the culture in Iran, they say so many of the people in Iran want to throw off their own government. And but the way to get to regime change in this is not to go over there bombing them. That will unite everyone against us. And so it's a very short-sighted policy by Israel trying to get us involved. The defense contractors are all up for it because they're going to make a boondoggle. The people who have the space weapons, they want to demonstrate those space weapons. There's too many of the worst types of people who would be served by this. And the whole pitch for the war, not only is it illogical, but it's anti-humanity. There's no question about it. Now, stopping Iran from getting a nuke, there are ways and means to bring our powers to bear to do that. And I think we've applied those methods. And I'm going to read you something tonight, as I said, that's now 15 years old, which sounds like the exact same assessment as we get into this tonight in our special report for the X series, Cayce Nostradamus, STEINER, the Mystery School Prophecies Revealed. We're going to take your questions here shortly, but before I go any further, what do you got?
Okay, so News Drifter says, question, what does DJ think of the 1981 movie The Man Who Saw Tomorrow with Orson Welles? Lancelot Link says, DJ, I recall one of Nostradamus's quatrains referenced, quote, the bear as saving Europe. Robert Scott says, but Cayce also said Russia might be the salvation of the world, and Fatima prophecies referred to Russia as well. The USSR was atheist, but Russia has always been Orthodox Christian.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say this in relation to Russia. I mean, their leadership, hasn't shown themselves very cooperative in a number of things. And they've been a problem on their side. But what happened was they were moving to a much closer relationship with us. And the Biden, Obama, Hillary agenda turned into trying to take over, and muscle in and really kind of get rid of them, because they had their own ideas about kicking GMOs out of their country. They weren't going to go for the trans agenda. There were a number of things that made them very unpopular with that New World Order crowd. So, it's a mixed situation. Like, you want them to have the best leaders as well, but I will say this, that there's no question that there's been a lot of provocative activity on behalf of NATO against Russia. And that's how we got into a situation like we got into with Ukraine, and funding Ukraine in this ridiculous war where all their soldiers are dying and we're giving them missiles. And, they're taking all these provocative actions, like going after the ICBM fleet of the Russians and bombing it, just creating a situation where it'll be such an all-out war that we'll have to get involved. I think that's what the defense contractors and the forces behind this whole thing are hoping and praying for. But, you have Russia basically facing NATO on its doorstep, and they said, oh, this is a good opportunity for us to flex our muscle and go into Ukraine. So those situations, which are just ongoing war, need to be resolved, and the United States should never take part in any of the hostilities in regard to Ukraine or in regard to Iran. It's just absolutely fascinating. It's absolutely true as well that Cayce refers to the hope of the world coming from Russia, but he does not say it's a political movement. He says it's a spiritual movement. So there's something in the core of Russia that is going to bring about a big surprise there on the spiritual thought, on religious thought for the world. And it's interesting because, Steiner will take you to places in considerations that you never thought about. And one of the most incredible things that he put across, which I think is quite fascinating, is that the people in Russia they still operated on a level where they were more closely connected to their astral body, that they hadn't totally fallen into materialism. And that's where you get characters like Blavatsky and the great seers. And they're known to have this remarkable psychic program in Russia. There's a famous 70s book about psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain. And some of the things they did reveal there is they had, they even had this incredible psychic who could do psychokinetic work, this woman. And, there are films of her lifting with her mind objects and tables and all kinds of things. And they, of course, had a very advanced remote viewing program, and ours was to catch up and all the rest of it. But the psychic side of all of this, ever since Rasputin and everything else, I mean, it goes back, and Gurdjieff and all the rest of it, the royal house in Russia tried to recruit Gurdjieff on a number of occasions. And as a matter of fact, one of his best students, I'm going to quote from tonight, learned about Gurdjieff because he was spying on him from the British government, because, they were like, this guy's doing this whole thing in the Royal Court of Russia. Let's find out about him. What is he doing over there? Edgar Cayce. Well, anyone who watches this show knows a great deal about the sleeping prophet. And Cayce's work is remarkable, and his organization in Virginia Beach, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, catalogs that work and does a number of symposiums and conferences and all kinds of things. They release a number of books. So they've done a nice job of, keeping his work alive. Cayce's work is, absolutely stunning on the level of Rudolf Steiner again, where these characters come forward and their whole life is about bringing this mystery tradition to the public. And through Cayce, we get all these things about, of course, reincarnation, holistic healing, our ancient past in Atlantis, this kind of Christian esoteric vision, and the revelations in there. I mean, it's just quite remarkable what Cayce was able to do. The whole thing about the Akashic records and all the rest. And the whole retrocognitive thing that Cayce could do, looking back and getting these details about the destruction of Atlantis, what took place, outlining the advanced technology that Atlantis had. And he was doing this in the 1920s and talking about television and, nuclear stuff way before it was out there. So whatever it was that Cayce was tapping into, he was the genuine article. And it's very rare. It's very rare. And, we've had a lot of people on the New Age circuit, trying to imitate Cayce or say, oh, I'm Cayce reincarnated and not all that horror show through Gaia TV. But, none of that stuff sticks. It's the Cayce work and the remarkable cataloging of some 15,000 readings that he gave over a period of 40 years. By the way, a number of those readings that were key, including the reading that he gave to Nikola Tesla, were stolen, along with a really fascinating set of readings on Bimini and the temple rising off of Bimini there, the temple of Poseidon, which was going to prove the existence of Atlantis. That disappeared, very interestingly, too. But here's some things that Cayce had to say about this period and what we'd be running into. And he mentions a couple of unusual things. As is understood by many, in the earth, manifestation of the cycle of time much repeats itself. There are still influences indicated in the lives of groups banded as nations, banded as peoples, still influenced by these happenings. What then, you ask, is the influence that makes for this great change that may be expected? The powers of light and darkness, as then, 1600 years before, as in those periods, so today. I want to say this before I go any further. What Cayce is saying, there's a 1600-year cycle around conflict. And that this period that we're in relates directly to a period that was taking place, say, in 300, 400 AD. Apparently some major warring factions. And if you go back 1600 years before that, there's this 1600-year loop that he's referencing here, which I think is one of those fascinating little threads that you wonder, what the whole tapestry on that. Let's go back to the reading. Powers of light and darkness, as then, as 1600 years before, as in those periods, so today we find nation against nation, the powers of death, destruction, the wrecking of that which has been and is held near and dear to the hearts of those who through one form or another have set ideals. These are not to be questioned in that as may be a helpful force, but what is coming to pass exactly? And how may you as an individual help? We see this coming forward, and he's talking about this period here. Strifes will arise through that future period. Watch for them near the Davis Strait. By the way, you're talking off Greenland there. Remember all the hubbub about Greenland when we started this year? In the attempts there for the keeping of a lifeline to land open. Something shuts down the shipping lanes. Watch for them in Libya and in Egypt and in Ankara in Syria. All the incredible problems we've seen through Syria and the fact that they have a new Al-Qaeda government. That's not good. Through the straits, and that's the Straits of Hormuz, about those areas, the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. So Cayce's giving us an indication there that this is the setup for war when those particular vital areas get squeezed off, that you're going to get into a situation of conflict. And he mentions Greenland, as he does on a couple of different occasions. And he mentions here the Straits of Hormuz by mentioning the Persian Gulf and the straits there. Because as we know, with Iran, about 20% of the world's oil goes through those straits, but they have complete control of the straits. So if they decide, you guys are giving us a hard time, you close the straits. And so that whole economy on the oil side, 20% of your oil is gone overnight. So it's a very dicey situation once you get into war footing with Iran. There's a high cost, as it were, right off the bat. Here's Cayce again, pointing out that Persian Gulf piece, pointing out somehow the war thing, which is a repeat of a cycle from 1600 years ago, is coming in hard and heavy, and it's coming in with the technology this time. And, we're getting an indication again that there's a Middle Eastern component. And now let's turn to, in the same vein, what others have had to say about it as we go forward here, finding the mystery in the Cayce Nostradamus Mystery School Prophecies Revealed. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly, and we're going to go about another half hour with you. How does that sound?
Okay.
What do you got out there?
I just wanted to say, there's too loud, so that's why I moved it.
Are you?
Yeah. So
Says who?
says everybody. That there are tremendously passionate opinions in the ideas room tonight. And, what I do know to be true is that our thoughts are powerful, our vibrations create outcomes, and we should choose wisely.
Sure.
And that
Yes.
everyone, and more than anything, what I find is that people are thinking, who should I judge, hate, and condemn? Instead of asking themselves, what can I do to lighten the darkness? And that is actually, if it's one message I can put out there, it's, it's very tempting to just go, who's the bad guy here? And, oh, it's that bad guy. People are fighting over who's the bad guy. You think that guy's the bad guy? I think this guy's the bad guy. I mean, come on. All right. What in our own little corner of the world, what are we doing to create peace? That's it, man. At the bottom, at the root of all of this.
Interesting. Yeah. No question about it. These are all the major kind of deep considerations on the level. I'm going to follow up on that too and say, the whole point around a kind of an exercise or a spiritual exercise of developing your life is to refrain from judgment. So you need to be able to discern something. For example, if you have a friend who's an alcoholic, you don't have to judge them for being an alcoholic, but you wouldn't give them the car keys to drive you home. You're discerning without judging, right? So there's a number of opportunities that you have to discern something versus judge. And, from Buddhism to Christianity and all the deep religions, judgment is, really a lot of judgment shows up in religious thought, but it's implied over and over again, New Testament and others, that judge not or you're going to be judged. So the idea of just creating this whirlpool of judgment isn't good. There's a way to discern things without hating it. As a matter of fact, resentment can link you to the very thing that you hate, keep you trapped on its wheel. So refraining from resentment is it's hardcore. If you go back to the 1984's book, this is why Orwell is such a prophet in his own way. What an amazing book. But one of the things that he got across, I think, which was crucial, was all about the 2 minutes hate that they were allowed to do. And they would get these people as part of the brainwashing, get them together and show them Goldstein on the screen. And Goldstein was the one who had betrayed the party. And, he's talking about his own ideals and things like that. And they're like, we hate him. We hate Goldstein. And it keeps them in that state so that they never challenge Big Brother. So the 2 minutes hate, we've seen it with different political figures. I mean, can you imagine? There are people probably in the audience who remember, the big anti-Nixon stuff because of Vietnam and all the rest. They held him up in a certain way. They held Reagan up as an anti-figure. They know who to put up there as someone for you to hate. And some of, make it easy, like Fauci and Clinton and Bill Gates and all the rest of it. But to be able to see through them to the forces that are manipulating the scene takes a real quality that, you go in and you don't have this knee-jerk reaction of just hating them on the surface. So, we certainly call out the things that they do. So I think it's important, though, what you're saying and putting across, which is if it just becomes an exercise, reporting deep news and getting really into that kind of journalism is not to just give you an excuse to hate something else. It's to get you into a knowledge zone where you understand the players, what's going on. And of course, in something like dark journalism, the stuff that we do here, you're not only going to hear about it from a geopolitical deep state level, we're going to get into the core issues, dealing all the way down, not just with the human psyche, but the psychospiritual connections. And let's do a little bit of that, a little more Cayce on this, and then I'll read a quote about the situation with the space weaponry and Golden Dome, and then we'll take your questions.
Goody.
Yes. All right. Speaking of powerful artwork, that is, of course, Nanette Christ's, good friend of ours, frequent in the Ideas Room. Her incredible artwork of these mystery school figures, but Rata, who is an incarnation of Edgar Cayce, as the Egyptian high priest, he came from this land of Persia, and he came from this Caucasus mountain range. And it's very interesting because he was an unusual figure. Cayce describes him as, he's a daughter of Zu without human father. Or was it the daughter of Zu didn't have a human father? It's hard to read that reading and figure out exactly what's being said there, but it's obvious that there's a Nephilim element going on here with Rata. And I think it makes sense that that's why he has this incredible influence of preserving the records from Atlantis there at the Giza Plateau and all the things, incredible things that he was able to accomplish. And the shadow that hangs around Edgar Cayce as a human being, in his own life, growing up there in Kentucky and moving to Alabama, Ohio, and then settling in Virginia Beach, and the incredible challenges of his own life, financial challenges, and challenges to his faith, and being thrown out of Sunday school because of his psychic readings. You think about the life that this guy had, and then you think about Rata, and you're like, isn't it interesting? Here's Rata, this incredible high priest, and he's putting together the Atlantean Hall of Records, and Cayce reincarnates to having to fish at Virginia Beach to keep himself and his family alive. I mean, it's a very interesting curve of how these lives work, and it's not quite how we understand karma and things to work out. So there's a great challenge there, I think, with Cayce and the shadow of Rata over his work to keep a high ethic. And he did. So there's a few things that Cayce has to say about the Great Pyramid, and I'll tell you why this is so powerful. Of course, we've just come through this Pyramid X documentary we put out about some of the newer things that they were able to discover using the space radar, SAR radar, and some of the great things that'll come out as a result of that. I'm certain that because they've gone around traditional archaeology to do this, that they're going to get results. And they're going to see part of the awakening of this era is that incredible Hall of Records, which, remember, Cayce identified as a pyramid. So when we think of the Hall of Records, we're thinking, oh, here's this big, oblong structure. No, it's a pyramid. It's an underground pyramid, which we referred to as Pyramid X in the documentary. So here's a little bit about how these discoveries around the pyramid will influence us in this period. So here's Cayce now. Much has been written respecting that represented there in the Great Pyramid, and the record that may be read by those who would seek to know more concerning the relationships that have existed and may exist and do exist between creative forces that are manifest in the material world. As indicated, there were periods when a much closer relationship existed, or should it be said, there was a much better understanding of the relationship that exists between the creature and the creative forces. In those conditions that are signified in the way through the pyramid as of periods through which the world has passed and is passing, as related to religious and spiritual experiences of man, the period in the present is represented by the low passage or depression, showing a downward tendency. This is 1932. You're about to hit World War II, and the big buildup through the Cold War into the 90s, and the decade of the terror, the COVID nonsense, all the black ops and everything, and then this consolidation for government, and maybe a push into World War III. So that's where that downward tendency would come from. This might be termed in the present as the Cruciterian age. No one's been able to identify the term Cruciterian, except there seems to be something about crucifixion there. Cruciatarian. Cruciatarian. Interesting, and I'm wide open for interpretations on that. By the way, hit me up. This might be termed in the present Cruciterian age, for which preparations are being made for the beginning of a new sub-race or a change, which is indicated from the astronomical or numerical condition, dates from the latter portion of the middle portion of the fall of 1932. In October, there'll be a period of benevolent influences of Jupiter and Uranus, which will be stronger, which from an astrological viewpoint will bring better interest in occult or mystical influences. Very interesting, because all of Nostradamus's quatrains contain this astrological edge. Here is Cayce bringing it into the Great Pyramid work. A little more from Cayce. At the correct time, accurate imaginary lines can be drawn from the opening of the Great Pyramid to the second star in the Great Dipper, called Polaris, or the North Star. This indicates it is the system towards which the soul takes its flight, having completed its sojourn through this solar system. In October, there will be seen the first variation in the position of the polar star in relation to the lines from the Great Pyramid. The Dipper is gradually changing. And when this change becomes noticeable, as might be calculated from the pyramid, there will be the beginning of the change of the races. There will come more and more greater influx of souls from the Atlantean, Lemurian, La-Ur, and Da civilizations. Well, we know Atlantis and Lemuria. We don't know La-Ur and Da very well. These conditions are indicated in this turn in the journey through the pyramid. How was this begun? Who was given that this should be a record of man's experience in the root race? For that is the period covered by the prophecies in the pyramid. This was given by Rata and Hermes in that period during the reign of Ararat, 10,500 BC. When the pyramid, Ararat, when there were many who sought to bring to man a better understanding of the close relationship between creative forces and man. Only those who have been called may truly understand. Who then has been called? Whosoever will make themselves a channel may be raised as a blessing that is all the entity body is able to comprehend. Who, having his measure full, would desire more, does so to his own undoing. And so it goes on. There's a remarkable thing dating the pyramid and the construction of it to 10,490 to 10,390 in construction. That's the 100-year pyramid, a period that it was built in, begun in the period of Ararat's reign with Hermes and Rata, who was Cayce in a former life, and what definite details are indicated as we enter the king's chamber. When we enter that understanding of being in the king's presence, with that of the mental seeking, the joy, the buoyancy, the new understanding of new life in the pyramid, in the period, during then, what is the significance of the empty sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid? That there will be no more death. Don't misunderstand, but the interpretation of death will be made plain. Is Armageddon foretold in the Great Pyramid? Please give us a description of it and the date of its beginning and ending. That's a pretty good question. No, not in what is left there. Armageddon will be 1,000 years with the fighting in the air, and as has been between those returning to and those leaving the earth. So you can see, as we would think of Armageddon as a great war with weapons and all the rest of it, here's Cayce saying, you know, the battle on a spiritual level is all of these emissaries are coming in, being sent in, and they're being blocked by occult forces from getting in. That's Armageddon, and it's 1,000 years. So, you know, I think with all the indications around 1998 and the year 2000 and everything, that's the beginning of that period. And that's what Cayce was bringing us closer and closer to that kind of understanding. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a couple of the technological developments that represent some of the problems that we're in that we need to work out, including the Golden Dome space weaponry situation. And then we'll roll right to your questions. How are you doing out there?
Good.
Excellent. What else you got?
Kusama Gaming says, could you talk about Cayce's LA prophecy? And
Yeah.
Happy Hermit 3D says, did Cayce say anything about artificial intelligence? What about aliens?
Yes, he did. You know, you have to remember something about Cayce. He dies in January of 1945, just before the end of World War II. And the great UFO wave and the things that happened there in relation to the world and its knowledge about UFOs and aliens and everything else doesn't happen until 1947. So the questions about it are scant. But here's a few that you can take to the bank. One, they ask him, is there physical life on any of the other planets in this solar system? Cayce's answer is very interesting. He says, at present, no. He doesn't say before it wasn't that way, but he says at present, no. But he also talks about how through the planetary sojourns, the bodies that you pick up as you go through the sojourns on those planets matches the environment. So here you get a physical body. When you move on, you reincarnate on Venus or somewhere, you get a different kind of a body, something that we can't see. And he did say that the body that you have on Venus is the closest to what we have here on Earth. But then there's a Mars body and all these other things. So there are sojourns there. They're kind of classrooms that bring you around, and then you come back and reincarnate here. Now, it's interesting because there's a statement that Rudolf Steiner makes about reincarnation, and it's why I call reincarnation such a crucial factor. And if somebody's of a different, spiritual thought about it and thinks, oh, reincarnation, I can't accept it or whatever, that's fine. But this is very important on the mystery school side to show how emphasized it was. In the case of Rudolf Steiner, what he's trying to put across to us is just how crucial it is. Here's what he had to say about reincarnation. Among the ideas advanced by spiritual science, that of reincarnation occupies a foremost place. The idea that the human individuality has to manifest over and over again in a single personality in the course of the development of mankind on the earth is at present but little understood. And moreover, it's generally unpopular. As we have seen and shall see, many questions arise in spiritual science, among them that of the meaning of repeated earthly lives. When we study the evolution of human life on Earth in the light of spiritual science, we find that there's a very deep meaning behind the fact that the human individuality passes, not only once, but many times through earthly life. Every epoch, every age has its special content, its special characteristics, and all the varied possibilities which it offers that have to be assimilated over and over again by the individual life of man and women. This is possible because humanity, with all that composes its being, is connected not once and for all, but over and over again with the living stream of evolution, looking upon this evolution as a rational progress into which new contents, new qualities are poured. We begin to realize the true significance of those great ones who have been leading and guiding spirits of the different epochs. So, for example, Rata as Cayce, John the Baptist as Raphael, Alexander the Great as Thomas Jefferson. They occupy this place. They come in over and over again. And Steiner saw that as a crucial understanding and bringing it across. With the advent of theosophy, they really brought it through, but in the beginning, they didn't emphasize it. And they even the mystery schools try to put the cat back in the bag on it because it was rocking the foundation. And they weren't sure, but it came out and we got a hint of that on our side. Of course, in the East, they've been living with the ideas for thousands of years, but over here, totally new concept. I want to point out something too, which is I've seen really since COVID, but even before that, all these different hit jobs on anthroposophical teaching in the Waldorf schools, particularly in England. But over here, I see some of it as well. I've been collecting articles, and I'll do something on it. But here in a BBC article, there was, should Rudolf Steiner schools receive public money? Steiner schools have been popular for decades among the more liberal and bohemian middle classes. All those terrible bohemians. They take their name from Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian-born occultist who died in 1925, but whose ideas live on. It is a spiritual doctrine that covers everything from homeopathy to biodynamic farming. Newsnight here at BBC has learned about complaints of bullying at Steiner schools that have been made to the Department of Education. In one case, a parent complained that a teacher at a privately funded school had said they thought bullying was part of how the kids worked out their comma. It's very interesting. One of the things that the Waldorf schools did during the COVID thing is they weren't going for the mandates and such. And I think, they were looking for angles about how to take these schools down. And I wanted to kind of put it on the map that they're after the Waldorf schools. And most of the Waldorf schools don't even have a heavy, Steiner doctrine about Atlantis or anything like that. They actually kind of just go through the phases of learning and higher education and things of that nature that Steiner laid out in a very, Montessori, that kind of teaching level. And so this idea of trying to portray it as this like bullying cult where you have to believe in Atlantis or else, I thought was particularly interesting and might, just might be a new stage in what they're doing with Steiner, who still is giving us these hints and things that are knocking over and reverberating in the 21st century. Here's a couple of things on the space weaponry, and then we'll hit it up. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew! Now that's your mystical Nostradamus ultimate prophecy revealed. And ultimately, we're going to have to look and see what happens, of course, with this situation brewing that could, ensnare the United States into a World War III scenario in Iran, which would be a nightmare. And, allies or not, the groups in Israel, this is exactly the kind of step that you wouldn't want to make. And as I mentioned, in the Kennedy presidency, he was pressured incredibly heavily to just go in and bomb the daylights out of Cuba once the missiles were there. And the kind of statecraft and restraint and the fact of getting the assemblage of nations together, showing the different nuclear sites, presenting it to the public, and then saying, to the Russians, you need to back off of this reckless track, left the Russians with no choice, really, but they needed to, go with their tail between their legs, take those missiles out, and that was the end of it. I think under a different type of presidency, like a Nixon presidency, that would have been a nuclear exchange. And they were wound up to do it. As a matter of fact, even Khrushchev, the hawk that he was, when they were laying out for him on the military side, they were saying, well, we'll put the nuclear missiles on this submarine coming in. And he's like, yeah, but what if they attack that submarine? We'll get into a nuclear exchange. And he said the hawks would look at him and give him the weirdest look, like, what are you talking about? Like you're afraid of engaging them in the nuclear, so this is the level of mentality that they were on. And Kennedy was under enormous pressure. As a matter of fact, there are back channels who were suggesting to him that they were going to impeach him for not attacking Cuba. So to take the pressure, Kennedy understood that the CIA had tried to basically second guess him into a war in Cuba during the Bay of Pigs, and they tried to trick him into attacking the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in 1961. Here he was, a little more seasoned the next year out, and the missiles were found there, and everyone's coming to him and saying, don't wait, just go in there and bomb the hell out of them. So, everyone owes a great debt to the Kennedy presidency and the actions of John Kennedy in bringing about a closure of this and exchanging, notes with his counterpart and saying, basically, there's a way for you to come out of this without being humiliated and after the fact of the Cuban Missile Crisis being over, not saying, hey, we won and you guys will be a parking lot and all that nonsense bravado. So there's a reason when we go back over the Kennedy legend, it's not just that he was a millionaire and, had this incredible Hollywood connection and all this stuff. Kennedy was a real statesman, and we need some of that going forward. Yes.
Do you want to mention 13 days?
Yes. Well, that's the whole point there, which is this is what happened during that period over 13 days. And it is, in fact, over that course of 13 days, finally, at the very end of it, they got a letter from Khrushchev who said, all right, if you agree that you're not going to invade Cuba, then we'll pull our missiles out. And then right after it, Kennedy got a letter. And the next letter said, you are reckless and, you can't order the Soviet Union around and all the rest of it. And Kennedy said, I'm going to respond to the first letter. I'm not going to respond to the second letter. And Kennedy responded to the first letter, and Khrushchev pulled the missiles out. So you have to know, how to appeal to the best instincts in the other side. And we need to show some of that. We're a mighty nation, an incredible nation with incredible values and everything else. So we really need to be the ones who are putting that across. And there's no question in my mind that the situation with Iran, everyone's tried different ways to solve that, including the Obamas, try to bribe the whole situation. Here, we'll give you a bunch of money on pallets if you don't develop your nuclear capability. But whatever it happens to be, short of a nuclear exchange, any option is a better option. So I think there's a way to be strong in all of that negotiating and to take the right tone right with it. Now, the Israelis have made it difficult because they've preempted what we would do and then said, hey, we're bombing the hell out of Iran, and you have to come and do it with us. So this is the very delicate tightrope that President Trump needs to walk, saying, you're an ally, I support you, but I'm not going to commit troops or treasure or armaments to this situation because that's not America first. America didn't do it, and we have our own policy in regards to Iran, sure. But there needs to be more of this on that side. And it's funny because, Tulsi Gabbard, very famously now, who's the director of national intelligence, she said Iran doesn't have the capability of having a nuclear weapon. Now, maybe there are other opinions on that, but she's the DNI. There's a reason she has that opinion. As a matter of fact, the major until an announcement today by Mossad that they were like, oh, they're weeks away from it suddenly. But many of the major intelligence agencies have said they didn't think Iran would be capable of this for another couple of years. So you see, there's differing opinions. And instead of dealing with those opinions, one of the things that Trump did that was a mistake was to say that Gabbard was wrong when he was baited by the media. He said, well, Tulsi Gabbard, the DNI is wrong, So, tricky situation, but there are ways and means to solve it without, dropping bunker busters and all the rest of it. So that has to be done in the most delicate fashion. So hopefully we're going to see some of that going forward. And part of the other things that are going on in relation to this, of course, is the development of the Golden Dome. And this is a $200 billion project, which is to put across this dome across the United States that would make it impervious to any kind of nuclear missile incursion, including hypersonic missiles. But here's the thing. That program was developed first, as I've mentioned, by President Reagan. And if you go deep, he was developing it as a result of hearing about and seeing the deep intel on the UFO file. And he felt we're going to need something that is operational, sure, but all of these countries, if we can get together with the Russians and say, this is a UFO defense grid and you can use it, we can use it, then maybe it'll actually help international relations. And this is where Reagan was coming from at the end of his presidency after he'd already been there. And he came across with this, and it's quite interesting because his idea was its dual purpose. Its stated purpose, which was a shield, is one thing, but shield from what? And that is the kind of big mystery around the Golden Dome, which is Star Wars 2, self-identified by President Trump. So you have to include the UFO file in your thinking around this if you're going to understand it clearly. I have more to bring forward, but to keep our timeline right on schedule, I'm going to go now to your questions, Miss Olivia.
Okay. The support studio says, a question for DJ. What would have to happen for COG to tell DJT, stand down, we're in control now? And also the support studio, who is the COG planes for?
Yeah, well, what you have to understand is the E-4B, which is the Doomsday plane, it's a floating fortress, was seen right above the White House during 9/11, okay? And it is the biggest signal of nuclear readiness. So the Doomsday plane was seen over, not over the White House, but in D.C. yesterday. So they're activating a kind of a nuclear footing, which has its own implications. Here's a few things on NORTHCOM, and I'm so glad that you asked because it's been on my radar so hardcore about their movements and their activities, especially since I believe they were behind all of the drone activity in December with their Homeland Synchronization project, test, drill, whatever you want to call it. And that was run by General Gio, who I said is the COG combatant commander and the head of NORAD. But he's the leader of NORTHCOM. I want to say this for people so they understand NORTHCOM. NORTHCOM's an illegal entity. NORTHCOM did not exist before the 9/11 attacks. So, we had CENTCOM to deal with things over in Europe. We had SOUTHCOM, keep an eye on all these different things in the Southern Hemisphere. And, when you get around NORTHCOM, it was created, and the idea was it's going to now basically run the United States. The United States had rules and laws about federal troops running the United States. And that goes back to Posse Comitatus. It goes back to the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, when the deal was, hey, look, you have all these Fed troops in here, after the assassination, enforcing these rules around the Civil War. The deal is we'll enforce the rules, but you have to have the Feds out of here, and local police handle this. And that's what they did. That's where we got Posse Comitatus, and that's been the constitutional rule ever since. 2002 changed all that, just like the Patriot Act changed all that. That's where the COG emergency piece got attached to the National Defense Authorization Act. So COG now is a big, major mover part of the government, and NORTHCOM is their headquarters. That's the hardcore end of the whole thing. So here's what we have just from a couple of days ago. Elevated security ordered for military installations in NORTHCOM area of responsibility. They're getting ratcheted up over the Iran situation, and they ratcheted themselves up, including 2,000 troops worth in the Los Angeles area. Somebody mentioned a Cayce reading about Los Angeles. Edgar Cayce predicted the destruction of Los Angeles in a massive earthquake. And he suggested San Francisco would also be devastated by a massive earthquake. But I think even in that era, they knew that Los Angeles and San Francisco were prone to earthquakes, but he was talking about the big one. And so, predictions and such, there's something in there, there's some weakness, the San Andreas Fault, all the rest of it, that makes this whole piece about Los Angeles and San Francisco kind of a crucial factor in consideration for Earth changes and things of this nature. So, God willing, it's a gradual process and these things can be managed, but they seem to be in the cards long term. So, U.S. Northern Command sets up task force for Los Angeles mission. So here we have NORTHCOM troops operating. Now, the National Guard was called in. That was appropriate because of the crazy rioting. And what they were trying to do was, this is what the Biden group was doing by just moving these people into the country. The idea was we'll create a force and we'll overthrow things city by city. So they have a pre-planned thing there, and pushing them back, deporting them. And also, I would say the other piece of this is, that I think is crucial, is having a policy where you really, don't have ICE under all of this pressure from the illegals they're trying to deport. And that process being orderly and all the rest of it. Look, they installed millions of people in here unethically, illegally, and all the rest of it. So this process of removing them, it has to be done by the book, but it's not going to look good no matter what you do. And so this is the nature of the situation that we're in. But this was cooked up, and I'm positive there was Chinese influence, Chinese government influence over it. And the people who are Chinese Americans here understand very well about the actions of the Chinese government over there. That's why they're here, and they would support a statement like that. And, we're lucky to have so many Chinese Americans here. Now, 300 California National Guard troops were in Los Angeles, and then the other 1,700 were NORTHCOM. So NORTHCOM was actually having the advantage there. That's dangerous, and my own recommendation when it comes to NORTHCOM is to not have them operational in the United States, and this is the thing. They're set up specifically for this purpose. So it's very, very tricky. And there were some hints. I pulled this headline out. The Black Hawk in DC crash, which took place back in February, it was reported that they were on, and they went down, that Black Hawk went down in DC. But they were on a continuity of government mission. And so COG was active. They were already building up there last January and February. And I think it was related to the whole drone activity piece. But there's something that we were seeing through drills and everything else. One of the things I learned from working with and being exposed to the work of Professor Scott and having him on this program and so many long discussions with him is the idea of how an op piggybacks on the back of different things, like a drill. For example, on 9/11, there was a drill going on, which was, Middle Eastern terrorist flies planes into buildings in New York. And so you can take the drill and piggyback on top of it. And then when the stuff is happening, the people who are looking at it are just like, oh, that's just the drill. And so they're not going deeper and asking the deeper questions on it. That's why you can get planes that kind of go off radar during 9/11 and all the ridiculous unexplained things, including the fact that they were able to identify the terrorists on the plane because, as the plane went into the building, this passport went out of the guy's pocket and it landed on a pile of rubble where an FBI guy was walking by. I mean, that's hardcore fairy tale. So we never got the truth around 9/11. And I think it's crucial because, that whole piece about NORTHCOM, COG, and all the rest of it, which we're up against now. And why I don't think that somebody who's in Trump's position, who's not exactly a favorite of the establishment, should be using NORTHCOM. If I were him, I would do an inventory of NORTHCOM and see exactly what they've been up to. Because I don't think, one of the things we have to remember is when continuity of government is activated, the president becomes powerless. And the leader of NORAD rules the United States. He's the combatant commander of COG. Then he appoints regional governors until the situation is back to normal. Well, that could be 20 years. Just ask the people in Ukraine. You ever get an election over there again? So, Trump has to be very careful with NORTHCOM, and I would install my own people at NORTHCOM and have a totally different policy about what's going on there. Yes.
Okay, News Drifter. Could they use NORTHCOM to take place of the disgraced FEMA in their COG plan?
See, this whole thing about continuity of government, FEMA's part of it. And this is the Jimmy Carter side of COG that was kind of moved into position, but then became hardcore under Reagan. And what they did was, you have to remember, COG comes out of a program of nuclear survivability hatched during the Truman and Eisenhower eras. And they mapped out tremendous underground bunkers and underground infrastructure that you wouldn't believe. Now, once in a while you hear, like a podcast pop click thing about, oh, billionaires in underground bunkers, look, how about an actual infrastructure of continuity of government, a command center that runs from the West Coast on one side all the way up to Maine? Deal with that. That's a real infrastructure. It's a totally underground government. And we've put a number of things on the record about that government. And the problem is that, and Kennedy saw this issue as well, because if you look back, there's a movie that's made, 7 Days in May, that Kennedy was really a major advocate of, because he said people need to understand what's actually going on. And it's a COG commander who tries to take over for the president. That's a 1960 the movie comes out, but they made it in 63. And of course, Kennedy is assassinated that year. But and there's a very telling sign where the guy has, Roswell over his soldier, the actual COG general who's doing the takeover bid. So, they were trying to hint things around in that movie, and Kennedy gave them total use, John Frankenheimer, the director of the White House, for it. I think there's something deep in 7 Days in May that was trying to be conveyed there about the COG thing, getting outside of the realm of regular government. And they were thinking, the thinking that goes into the COG bunker mentality is when they put a guy up there like General Guillot or whatever, he has to take on the psychological ramifications of the United States has suffered an emergency. You are now in charge. You're in charge of civilization moving forward, about us propagating as a species. And they go into this whole mentality about it, about building a new world. And so we need to understand that that's part of the job, but this group, we talk about a breakaway group. The COG people live on another planet. I mean, there's no oversight. They're budgeted billions of dollars every year. They have a massive underground infrastructure, and there's a tremendous amount of people who overlap from the private sector. So you have government and private sector people. So when you see people like Oprah Winfrey coming out and, towing the line for the government about vaccines or whatever it is, there's a reason for that. She's part of the entertainment aspect of this continuity program. So make no mistake about it. The tentacles run extremely deep. And in my mind, having troops from NORTHCOM active in the United States is, if anything, it works against the interests of the Trump administration. So I'd be very, very cautious about NORTHCOM, and I'd install my own directors immediately. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, Cayce Nostradamus, Ultimate Mystery School Prophets, Rudolf Steiner, giving us that hint about the period that we're in. And we've gone into the space weapons activity. We're going to take a couple more of your questions. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a newsletter. It's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch with all the incredible censorship that we've been witnessing as well. And, some of the things you're going to learn about, the incredible interviews we have coming up for you, X-series episodes that'll blow your mind, and extraordinary documentaries. There's a docuseries that we're doing. Of course, Roswell Reignited, that whole thing is in there. The Craze in the Hot Zone, Pyramid X, it's all there for you in the newsletter, along with hints of this live events that we're working on. And basically, you'll get it once a week. It'll let you know about those fantastic things. It's all there at darkjournalist.com. So stand up and be counted. And with that, a couple more questions from Miss Olivia, and we're done.
Okay, David Tremina. These COG people are literally working in underground cities. They are the Morlocks. And KC says, some have posed that maybe the Golden Dome is really some kind of surveillance control grid a la Hunger Games.
Well, I mean, see, the problem is there's a lot of problems. There's a track that took place here, and I'm going to lay it out for you. There was the tension between Elon Musk and Trump, to the point where Elon Musk started to say that Trump was part of Epstein Island and all this incredible nonsense, and acted like a psycho. Now, at a certain point, Trump said, well, I'm not even sure why we give contracts to somebody like that. And Elon Musk said, oh, yeah, well, then we're going to take our whole Dragon program and dismantle it. That means your astronauts will be stuck in space. So this guy was thinking, I'll strand astronauts in space to get back at you, Trump. All right, that's who you're dealing with Musk. Can you imagine that infrastructure? It doesn't seem like he likes to respond to anyone, not even the president. And, Musk has had all this rhetoric about, oh, I'm free speech. I believe in that. Well, he's acting like a psycho. Can you imagine somebody like Bezos with that kind of power? He already has tremendous power. So, these people are forming an extracurricular, it's an extra layer of government, and we didn't give them the permission to do it. So, it's very dangerous to put the hand. I know we have this, thing about the government is the wrong place to put the power, but these other people that have arisen on the private side, on the tech side, have shown themselves to have absolutely no scruples at all. And I think it's a big, big problem. And whenever they get around power, they seem to go into this Attila the Hun, Dr. Jekyll routine. Here's the thing. So that happened. Immediately afterwards, you had the tremendously sad assassination piece that took place. And with the 2 state representatives in Minnesota, and then the other 2 who were shot 17 times and survived. And you had this one assassin go out and commit these crimes, and then he finally was caught, and we got into it. This guy was a millionaire, but he lived in this weird shack with a roommate, even though he had a wife and kids in this beautiful house. And his job literally was slicing up eyeballs. This is what we're talking about. So that was very strange for me.
Like dead, disembodied eyeballs.
Oh yeah,
from
yeah,
corpses.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and so there was a lot of messaging, I think, in the assassination things, and I wondered, there's going to be a vote at some point about, do we go to war in Iran and all the rest of it? And was this guy sent out to kind of do the cleanup operation and act as a threat incentive to say, we have these sleeper cells, and anytime we can activate them, and there you are, cozy as a congressman or whatever, and zap. So these things, if you follow along, there's a track and a trend that was going on. Immediately after that, boom, Israel out of nowhere. Now, we know the problem's been ongoing for years and years, but still, nobody expected Israel to just start bombing Iran and saying, this is part of our liberation. This is great. We're going to go for it. They certainly thought they were going to get Trump and the United States on board. I don't know what back channel talks that they had that convinced them of that, but Trump sounded pretty convinced right off the bat that he was going to join in, which was also weird. Well, there's a lot of pushback from his own base, and the situation is kind of stifled out a little bit. And they said, well, maybe, we're going to look at this for 2 weeks or whatever. But the correlation of this, and the LA riots in the middle of it, NORTHCOM coming in, being activated. When's the last time NORTHCOM was activated? They got activated for a mission during COVID. And that was to, bring supplies from a ship off the coast of New York into Manhattan and all this kind of stuff. But, this kind of deployment activity, NORTHCOM's very active. And the fact that they were active in relation to the drone aspect, and there was all this monkey business about, the drones are, an Iranian plot. We heard a lot about that. They're sending these drones in from Iran. The Iran thing has been kicking around in a very strange way ever since the election. And somebody's operation, the superstructure is operationally in favor of going to war with Iran. And somehow they're thinking that they can sell that to Trump's base, which is an impossibility. So now I think whoever it is recalculating, but it's incredibly dangerous. That sequence of events, I believe, gives us a handle on exactly what's been going on here. And then there's a report that just came out, and I promise you I'm going to do a lot on this, but there's a group out there called Milnet, and I have the whole article here, which I find absolutely fascinating. And, that's another artist conception of this Golden Dome, by the way. It's a major UFO defense grid. That much I can tell you. But here's just a headline for you on this. And it's Space Force is contracting with SpaceX for new secretive Milnet SATCOM network. First of all, we've had enough secrecy for a lifetime. The whole point is to bring this stuff out of the secrecy. We don't want to see military satellites cropping up and, it's some secret military program. We want to know about them, approve them, and then you can put them up. So, and it's interesting that NORAD, not NORAD, but our friends at the National Reconnaissance Office, the NRO, are doing this. and taking part in it, because they were in operation for 30 years before the public even knew they existed. So my point is, on the whole UFO side is there already an active UFO defense office or all the rest that we won't find out about until 30 years from now, but they're fully operational. And that's, the Golden Dome and the extra technology, the exotic tech is being deployed as a result of that. And we're not hearing anything about it. So just a little bit here. The Milnet contract with SpaceX is being paid for by the Space Force, but managed by the NRO. The Space Force is contracting with a new government agency. Okay. So Milnet is going to be like, you've got SpaceX and all of their satellites. Milnet is going to be like the military component in low Earth orbit managing these things with tremendous surveillance capability. So this thing needs to be, instead of it just being a program and, hey, it's going through Space Force and all the rest of it, they need to have hearings in Congress about why it's secretive, first of all. And second of all, exactly what is it? And if they're military satellites, doesn't this have to go through some kind of approval process, and you can't just stick the stuff up there? Quote, Milnet is onboarding to the United States Space Force through Space System Command right now, but specifically to Delta 8, and we are completely relooking at how we're going to operate that constellation of capabilities for the joint force, which is going to be significant because we've never had a DoD hybrid mesh network in low Earth orbit. Yeah, there's a reason for that, which is, that's a totally different step for the military. So this is the militarization of low Earth orbit. And, the fact that SpaceX is involved and the NRO is involved and it's all secrecy, this is definitely one of those big warning signs. There's like a huge red flag for the whole thing. And if I were in that congressional committee and they can't get any of the UFO hearings going because everybody keeps getting sick, because so we hear, and I don't blame them for getting sick because the disinformation they have to spew, then forget it. You know what? Scrap the UFO hearings and have Milnet hearings. How about that? They're unidentified UFOs. They're military space satellites. Yes.
Okay. So Patrick Bateman says, can DJ go more into Mavis? Is this some yet to happen Iranian ruler? Please ask DJ. Also, Robert Scott, Blue Turban Man, the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, Julie Wasted. Wasn't there a new prophet that was saying that the evil was born in 1962? How old is the Iranian leader? Khomeini's son wears a blue turban sometimes.
Yeah. That's the 62 thing is a Gene Dixon prophecy. And her prediction was that Akhenaten and Nefertiti come back, they're reincarnated, and he's the Antichrist. And
everyone is thinking Obama.
Well, it's very interesting. If you look at Mavis and then you think of Osama bin Laden, and then we got Obama, and there's Saddam, all of these mix of names, you can see, that whole whirlwind of things. And, I remember I met Dolores Cannon. And Dolores Cannon, I think, took an interesting crack at all of the Nostradamus work by having these people in deep trance, trying to communicate with him and all the rest of it. And, her work was one level of things. But in any case, when I met her, I asked her about that. And she had said to me something about the idea that when Nostradamus was seeing his visions, he'd go up in a whirlwind and all this stuff would be whirling around him, and he'd do his best to kind of capture the names and the pictures and all the rest of it, and then do the quatrains with it. So if you can see this Mavis name coming through, it has something about that Osama, Obama, that whole thing that was going on. And when he's seeing that as a step in the development of these heightening tensions with the Middle East, of course, you can go back and look through, the 1967 war, the Arab oil crisis, the Iranian 1979 hostage crisis, and, some of the things that took place during the Reagan administration. This thing has been building up, and we got it, all the way to 2001, where presumably this guy in a cave ordered this incredible takedown of the entire United States Air Force. So completely ridiculous possibilities there. And yet this whole thing stemming around the Middle East over and over again. And so here we are face to face with that whole thing. Of course, they got us into decades of terror wars and, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and a lot of blood and treasure there for the United States, and not a whole lot to show for it. As a matter of fact, that government in Iraq still favors Iran. So, yeah, so much for that. You just bought a great friend for Iran. So, but those companies and the tentacles that went in there and used the warnings and all the rest of it and scared the public to get their interests in there, like Exxon and Halliburton and all those different companies. And the defense contractors like Lockheed and Boeing and all the rest of it, who get the creme de la creme of supplying the United States military, then you can see that there's going to have to be some direct, the public is going to have to say, this is our line in the sand. You can't bring America into war in Iran. And I think it's crucial. We're already seeing the signs of it, that's the red line too far. And we see, I think, in a destiny sense, the danger of it leading to a massive world war. Whereas if cooler heads prevail and there's actually statecraft involved, you might get a totally, totally different situation. That's what Trump said that he was about, and I believe that. And in his first term, he wasn't, he didn't have any wars in his first term except for bombing ISIS. And, we did that with Russia as a joint exercise. So, there were very good, leftovers from that first administration and Trump's actions, which showed that he wasn't a pro-war guy like a Bush or an Obama. And so it's very interesting to see him in this situation where he's up against the ultimate wet dream of the Cheney, neocon wing of that whole thing, which was to go after Iran, which Cheney wanted to do in 2008 before the Bush administration lost their ability to do anything. That was the last year of their administration. And he was like, oh, they have a nuke. We have to take them out, So, the whole thing calls for real intelligence and all the rest. And unfortunately, as we know with Iraq and all the rest of it, that stuff can be so cooked up. So you have to, if you're President Trump, you have to go about this in a careful fashion, and you can't go in there like the rodeo with the Israelis and just start bombing Iran, because you will tank the economy and you'll destroy the credibility of the United States in that section of the world. So, yeah, it's very, very serious. Yes.
Could you talk about central banking?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a core aspect to this, but I think I'll save that for another show.
Well, I mean, I just think you don't have to go into detail, but just, that's the real agenda going on.
Yes. And I do think that, with the incredible consolidation on the financial side and the kind of digital gulag they want to build around this, that, the central banks and the forces behind them have wanted the Iraq war, the Iran war, for a long, long time. But it was completely implausible because, Iran had standing, it has its own allies, and it, unlike Iraq, which was in a fragile, more fragile situation, and also had a leader in Hussein that was just, everyone wanted to get rid of. And immediately after 9/11, they had the ability, they had some momentum because of this idea of terrorists coming after the United States. But this situation, you got a culture that, has been there for thousands of years. And, the people who run Iran have their own kind of religious dogma, and, they run it like a dictatorship in some ways. But the people in Iran are very modern, and they're trying to move their culture forward. So I think, if anything, eventually we could be allies. But right now it's a perilous situation to misread, and you can't go in with the kind of cowboy bravado that we went into Iraq with, because that does serve, the defense contractors and the power brokers on the central banking side. So, yeah, you start to see that in their interests, just like with Vietnam, all the carnage and all the different things that happen to the families and all the rest of it, that gets forgotten. And in the meantime, all these groups have done fantastically well in the background. And those are the war profiteers. So war needs to be the last option on the table and not taken as the first option the way that Israel did. And now they're trying to drag us along into it. And I'm not, there's a whole thing about Israel, and I'm not even somebody who lays all these things on Israel that other people do. But certainly, at this point, they're becoming a massive foreign policy liability. And, if they're going to be allies and all the rest of it, we can say, you started this war with Iran. That's your war. And we'll look at our own objectives as far as Iran's nuclear sites and our own nuclear deal with them. But the two, we have influence. This is the thing. And if anything, it looks like Israel just decided on their own that they could do this, and that we were on the cusp about what to do, and that this would knock us over the edge. But it does seem like they've had an agenda there to be like, this is our enemy, and you guys get along on our side, and gets us involved in a much wider war. So it's a perilous situation and something to be avoided at all costs. If I were in the White House, that's the advice I'd give to President Trump. Don't do it. And I think there are programs with our military, with our intelligence, to keep the Iranian nuclear program hemmed in. So, I don't think you need to go to war over it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, deep tonight. I want to recommend a couple of things here before we leave you. One is, of course, this Roswell Reignited series that we're doing. And this is opening up the whole Roswell and the UFO file aspect from a totally different position. We just did an episode, that's a member episode with Joseph Farrell on it, along with a public episode that we did with Joseph. And it centers all on a very important person in history, Jesse Marcel. You've heard the name. And I wanted to point this out, this is the actual markings that he saw on some of the wreckage, his own drawing. And, we think about the hieroglyphs, the way they're described and stuff, but that's what Jesse Marcel Sr. drew when he saw them. Quite fascinating indeed. And you're going to be hearing a lot more about that as we go along coming up. And like I said, if you're new here and you haven't signed up for the newsletter yet, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for a free newsletter to find out all about the incredible docuseries that we have coming up for you. We'll take the last question you got.
Okay, I'm going to combine all these.
Okay.
So Leo Persia says their plans are being accelerated because they know something significant will be happening soon. The West is in desperation mode because of the rise of BRICS. And also, Najat Madri, it's the same playbook over and over again. It makes me wonder, is it they who are stupid, or us, not all of us, who continue to fall for it?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, that's really true. And, it's crucial. There are times when you have to stand up and be patriotic, and that might include going to war against your enemy. We did it with the American Revolution when we had to fight Britain. And, Britain eventually became our greatest ally. So it's interesting how these things work out. But I think in the case of the Iran war, we've seen that playbook. And what we haven't seen is the danger involved in that playbook, because, again, Iran is like 10 Iraqs. It's a major population. It's a major military. It has major connections. And I would say after what took place in Syria, that entire region is still highly destabilized. So something like this is exactly the wrong track. And, I wanted to point out that there may be a group of mystery guys out there who know more about this after all. And that, of course, is the message in a bottle. That's a shot of the police in front of the Great Pyramid. I came across that and could not resist, but sending out an SOS. There they are. And Sting just celebrated a birthday recently, so happy birthday, sir. And with that, Miss Olivia, I would say that we're done with our
We
episode.
had a lot of great questions we didn't get to tonight.
Well, we'll come back.
Okay.
We'll come back for sure.
Yeah, the story, unfortunately, is not going to go away anytime soon.
Well, I expect a lot of special reports coming up while we're doing everything else. And I'm very much on top of what's going on with NORTHCOM in relation to all this. And that's where I think, I'm going to be able to deliver a lot of reporting that you're not seeing out there because NORTHCOM just does not get the coverage. And NORTHCOM for me is crucial on all this. I wanted to end with a Gurdjieff quote, something Bennett said about Gurdjieff and what we need for this period and what he decided there. This goes back to 1927, so it's about 100 years ago, but check this out. Gurdjieff came more and more clearly to see that the ways of helping people which have been used in the past are no longer applicable because modern man cannot even listen to what is most necessary for him to hear. Notwithstanding so many years of profound study of the human psyche, Gurdjieff researched and reached the conclusion in late 1927 that a new penetrating approach to the problem must be undertaken. He accordingly imposed on himself a way of life that he would, as he says, cause each person to take off the mask kindly provided by life and disclose the depths of his or her nature. The procedure adopted he describes as finding the most sensitive aspect of each person from whatever class or race he might come across and whatever position they might hold and treading on it. It can well be managed and imagined that such a procedure made him many new enemies and even scandalized many old friends, since he carried his procedure into every kind of relationship. Very few people are able to see the necessity or even the sense of his actions, and there's no question that many obstacles were created to the acceptance of his teaching. Nevertheless, for anyone who's felt the obscurity of the human psyche, it is obvious that what he did was indispensable, partly to establish the facts which it was necessary to know, and partly also to further the aim equally important and necessary, namely to try and recover his own health. Not only had his bodily strength almost destroyed by a serious automobile accident, but he carried the results of going through many difficult things in his life. Now, what's interesting, and why I mentioned that, is there's a little aspect, a little snapshot in there that I think we need to adopt as well, which is we might need something that we haven't been getting in podcast land or in the different considerations around the media or even in kind of independent thought, which is we might need a new way of looking at a number of things, which takes us out of that kind of emotional knee-jerk reaction to all these things, but also helps us go deeper in our own quest. And part of that has to do, if you find in the Cayce work, about having an ideal going forward. And, so the ideal on this program, as I've mentioned, is to be potent with the truth and to make it interesting and to explore those deep mysteries with you. But I think we need an ideal in general around the independent side of this, which is to reject the pop click and, the thing I started the show with, the crazy CIA, John Ramirez. I know about alien hybrids and all that kind of stuff. And, the serious hybrid research that comes from David Jacobs and stuff. What I'm saying is reject the counterintelligence, government and central intelligence, NSA, NRO, NGA, all of these actors coming into the fields of independent thought, independent research, and throw that line out and go on a totally different track, develop that ideal, and it needs to be shaken off. And that's where Gurdjieff's thinking, Gurdjieff's method is so good, because he's saying, I'm going to, hit it at its most sensitive point and shake it, And the most sensitive point for so many of those people is they thought, oh, hey, I found another new age instructor or whatever. And the first thing they would learn from Gurdjieff is that, he didn't respect on the surface any of their great accomplishments. So if he met like a film director or whatever, he wasn't at their beck and call. And how that applies to what I'm saying is there is also a kind of let's say there's a phase that we've gone into on the independent side. It's always taken place, on the mainstream media side. I'm not even going to address that. But on the independent side, I've been able to watch it because I've been a part of it. And as I was of mainstream media so many years ago. And what I've seen on the independent side is the descent into marketing wasteland. And if it continues going down that road, it won't be worth anything more than the corporate media. As a matter of fact, the corporate media might even do it better in some ways. So that whole thing about trying to outdo the other guy to get high in the Apple rankings so you can get bigger sponsors and all the rest of it, there's a very human competitive thing with that, but that doesn't get you to real journalism, and it doesn't get you to the kind of breakthroughs that you need and the types of tools that are available to us by having an ideal. So that's my message around this, which is on the independent side, we need to have an ideal, and that ideal needs to, to avoid the sensationalism as much as possible, and to really deliver with the deeper motivations and the deeper knowledge. And with that, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
People are asking about what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
And it's up to us.
Yeah.
There's this feeling of like the future's written. And the thing is, if we let the algorithms control us so that we fight with each other and get more and more polarized.
Yeah.
And we're warlike, which is very, Elon, like what you're talking about is just, if we are infants, what are we going to get? We're going to get that control grid with digital ID, everything, because we've proven that we're children who need masters to control us, that we don't deserve our freedom.
Yeah.
We need to prove that we are adults who are capable, who are responsible with freedom. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but I know that's the answer.
Interesting. Wow. Very interesting. I think it is fascinating too to see these people rise so much in life and become the tops of these, corporations that are billionaires and all the rest of it, and then to act in such a way that you can see that they had no personal growth along the journey, that they were just kind of focused on a bottom line or placed into position or whatever. And when they get into a position to help humanity, we see them exposed for the kind of petulant children that they are. It's interesting, though. I do feel, I want to say this, I'll put this across, which is I have a great faith in the human ability to respond and rise to the challenge of the situation. And, like the conversations we have in the ideas room, it puts things on a different track, and we're capable of that. And that group, even if Dark Journalist is like a lone outpost on some of this stuff, that force ricochets along the way. And so when you find fantastic work like Gigi Young's work, for example, and the incredible things she's doing with her Occulted series, there are important voices and forces that need to be elevated in all of this. And we try to do that as well. And of course, with the work of people like Bosley and Dr. Farrell and others, there's important voices that need to be raised in all of this. So let's make sure that they don't get, co-opted and clouded out in the din of all this with, the whole podcast lust for viewers thing and all the rest of it. And, I'm all for them having big shows and all that, but be relevant. I remember reporting one of these big personalities had 46 people running their show. Well, if you have 46 people running a show, it better be damn good. And you better not have CIA people on talking about UFO file secrets, because that's the biggest joke on the planet. And with that, Miss Olivia, your super chats are up.
I will, but I'm going to mention Robert Scott said, bingo, well said, Olivia. And John Adams said, all freedoms begin with self-governance. governing ourselves personally first. Otherwise, failure to do so invites tyranny.
yeah.
Amen. So that's it. And let
That's
me
really
get
true.
super chats up. Okay. Kusama Gaming, Brian Whitaker, CC, Durbin Downey, Ryan Osiris, Corey Cartier, Susan Donahue, Jay Parsons, Mirror 13, Harry I, Robert Scott, CB, The Bikini Truther, Short Order Cook 1, John Matthews, Doyle Wayne, Jake, Eurythmia's Fun, Jenny Lavery, Debbie Klinglesmith, Jonathan McIntosh, Rich Hall, Debbie McAdoo, and Mike Brosnahan. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Wow, fantastic. And we really appreciate it. Of course, to all our supporters and subscribers, we couldn't do what we do without you. And thank you. And we appreciate the super effort on your part. I wanted to read this before we leave, and it has to do with a group called the Transcenders, which were a psychic channeler, a gentleman very much like Edgar Cayce, who I was lucky enough to meet before the end of his life. And I recorded about 15 hours with him in trance, going over various things. And that was a number of years ago, probably 2010, I think, probably somewhere around there. And he was quite fascinating. And it's interesting because there was a NORAD officer who got this prediction from him about these UFOs that would show up over New York City on October 13th, 2010. And in fact, they did. And so I was curious about who made the prediction, and I called the NORAD officer, and he said, "Don't, we'll do a whole interview about it. You know, I've got a bunch of things coming up, but we'll do that." This is before I even had the show. But I was working for a magazine, and he died, that guy, unfortunately, Stan Fulham. He died about 3 weeks after that. And I was like, oh, unbelievable. But I heard that it was, in fact, this psychic who had given him this heads up about the whole thing. And what an incredible experience. Unfortunately, Rick Thurston, who was part of this Transcender group, he was the channel for this spiritual group. And he was very much like a Cayce kind of a guy. I mean, he worked with children with disabilities and things like that. Just a tremendous person. And but his psychic information was off the charts. And when you spent time with him in trance, you know, you could tell by the nature of what he was putting across. But he talked a lot about different things. He talked about aliens. He talked about other things. And Earth changes, Cayce, you know, all the rest. But one of the things that came up in his sessions with Stan Fulham was about this very issue of Israel and Iran. And I think it's very telling because here they were talking about it in 2010 because the rumor then was that Israel was going to attack Iran and America would get involved. And here's what the Transcenders had to say about it, for what it's worth. And I find it really revelatory. Transcenders comment and say, remember, they are very close together. If you dropped a nuclear bomb on Israel, Iran would definitely be affected by the fallout. It's like shooting yourself in the head because you cannot drop nuclear bombs on a neighbor and not be affected. President of Iran's comments were literally that the Middle East culture would overwhelm Israel with beliefs, religion, and with people. That is when Ahmadinejad was saying, you know, we'll overcome Israel. But it goes along, and there's this whole kind of back and forth with them commenting on it. Let's see if I can grab another quote here before we leave. And he's saying that there was a situation there in Iran where the culture was overcoming the religious structure, the overly religious structure that it was under. And so the Transcenders, in speaking about these things in general, said there must be a new consciousness, a new vision, a concept that will provide a powerful and profitable alternative to the huge investments and energies committed to the building and maintenance of nuclear weapons that would bring the world to total extinction if used. There are two alternatives: destroy all nuclear weapons worldwide and divert all nuclear capital to battling the environmental crisis, convert the world's nuclear arsenals to a clean nuclear energy system for all nations under the administration of different countries. And so the transcenders said, quote, the thing that is most needed is that of energy or power. If you have power for all the peoples, they can turn on their lights, heat their homes. You'll have a higher level of contentment, a higher level of acceptance. So if the world were to supply power, and then you don't really need nuclear arms because everyone is more content, productivity increases. The problem with that is you have all these high-grade uranium and nuclear power plants, but if those power plants are owned by the United Nations or some other international body, then no one is going to touch them, because if you do, it's like attacking the whole world. So there are ways around it. There are concepts and ideas that, if given a chance, would take root and grow. And it's very interesting because they get into this idea of how you would get out of a nuclear paradigm period, which I think is crucial. And on the kind of funky styly side, here's what they had to say about leaders dealing with Pleiadians. Are you ready? Quote, a question: did the Pleiadians communicate with politicians or the military? The Pleiadians communicated with top military people, and these people discussed with scientists, geologists, to find out whether it was a reality or potential, and then finding out that there was a probability of a huge impact on the Earth, depending on where, etc., of the testing locations of these kind of underground nuclear tests. So here, the transcenders say there's a whole group watching us, basically with these nuclear tests and trying to work directly with us. And he refers to the Greys as the Botes, and that whole Botes region space, that's where they come from. And what he has to say is, I think, interesting, and I'm just going to throw it in here as a wild card at the end.
Let's do it.
The development of the hydrogen bomb on Earth was a matter of grave concern to these other groups, and there was a great deal of political intervention at that time, coupled with accelerated UFO activity, not only from the Council, but also from other planetary systems, who came to witness the probability of primitive society blowing up their planet into dust at the height of the Cold War. That was the first time the Botes, the Greys, who had actually been in contact with the United States government for many years, stepped forward and said, this is not a good idea. As you know, the Botes have no particular emotion, and they are not noted for compassion. They are more of a scientific, rational, logical process. And they even stepped forward and said, enough is enough. That is not the path to travel. You are heading towards total destruction of your planet. The Pleiadians had planted individuals in positions throughout the world to alter the path to destruction. So he's saying that the Pleiadians are actually planting people in government. And so he goes on. But what's interesting to me there, and he talks about how the whole process of cloning is something that the Botes, the Greys, did to such a point where they had no capability left, that they were pure clones, and that part of their abduction program was to take and splice out the emotions of humanity and to kind of revive their own ability to be something other than a clone. I think the whole thing was very interesting, because that information now, over 15 years since I spoke to them, so many of the things that they talked about have come to pass, and they reference this particular Iranian-Israeli issue and its relation to the United States. So I find that fascinating, and I'll leave you with that tonight. I'll do a couple of shout-outs, though, before we go. You got something there?
John Matthews says, if the Pleiadians are planting people in government, they need to try harder.
I would heartily agree. But all those contactees had blonde hair and stuff. I don't know. All right, let's see.
Can I along those lines, I just want to throw this one thing out. So I was listening to this channeler who's calling it kind of a solid citizen, I'll say. I don't believe all channelers by any means.
Sure.
And but she went to China and she met a Taoist, like the Taoist master in China.
Mm-hmm.
And she perceived him as this blue light being.
Whoa.
And there was a translator. He didn't speak English, she didn't speak Chinese, but they were communicating telepathically. And she said that the Chinese government consults with him.
Interesting.
So that, I don't know, it's just really interesting to consider the influence that either extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings are having on this planet at this time.
Well, I'll tell you what's interesting about that is the transcenders. You know, I found out later that a lot of political people consulted them and did readings with them. Of course, we know this from Cayce and Woodrow Wilson and Henry Wallace with Cayce. So, you know, Gene Dixon with FDR and Nixon and Reagan with the astrologers. And boy, have I got some interesting things to tell you about political power and psychics. So we're gonna get into that, but I'll save it. Here's a couple of shout outs. Who have we got out there? Joe Gallo, Najat, it's great to see you out there. Gordon McDonald, shout out from Santa Cruz. Hello, Santa Cruz. Hopefully it's a nice night out there. Melania is probably a Pleiadian. Yeah. she certainly could be. Fascinating. Femnina. It's good to see you out there. Richard Hastings. Thanks, DJ and Miss Olivia. Thank you, sir. Alchemy by Angela. It's great to have you out there. Amazing information tonight. Thank you, Daniel and Olivia. Yes, bravo, Miss Olivia. Nicely done. And of course, we had Gigi out there. Fantastic. If you haven't seen Occulted yet, and of course, all of Gigi's work is great, but go to her YouTube channel. Just go to Gigi Young and take a look at that, because that is powerful. And of course, the rest of it is available at gigiyoung.com. And let's see, Tina Boric is out there. Spiderweb. Junica, like Picasso. Interesting. Sometimes it's fun to dime in on the ideas from in the middle there. Solstice episode to remember. Thanks, DJ and Olivia. Thank you, Cece. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Oh, hey, it's Nanette Christ. DJ and Olivia Wings Girl, thank you for a lovely, informative show. Let's all pray and invoke the will of God to be established on earth. Yes. Wow. Incredible. And, you know, I always remark about Nanette's incredible artwork. She does so many things, but her art is something to be seen. I can tell you that. Savage Psyche, thank you so much for being out there. And let's see who else we got. Ross Thistle Artworks. Let's see, where can I find out about ARE funding Hawass schooling? I tried, I couldn't find anything. Well, I mean, first go to the segment in Pyramid X where I talk about it. There's a whole Giza Gate section in there. So you can start with that. And then if you have questions, just email me at admin@darkjournalist.com. But yeah, they put him through the University of Pennsylvania on a special degree. And then they put Mark Lehner through. Remember, Lehner was a high school dropout, but he was dating Hugh Lynn Casey's daughter. And then they put him through school in Chicago, and then they placed him in Cairo to be their man in Cairo. So Lehner and Hawass were like this inseparable guard dogs there on the Giza Plateau. And then Hawass got wrapped up with the Mubarak government. They made him a cabinet officer, and then Mubarak got thrown in prison for corruption. And I have great stories from our dear late friend Carmen Bolter about Hawass, and she lived in Egypt for 20 years. And I can tell you, I mean, you know, there was a lot of shenanigans going on. So Giza Gate that I put together in Pyramid X, it's funny because right after Pyramid X came out, and I talked with Farrell about this, but I mentioned Hawass, and Hawass had kept a really low profile. And I mentioned Hawass, and I did that whole Giza Gate section. And then 3 weeks later, he shows up as a guest on Joe Rogan. I mean, this was extraordinary timing. And I just thought, boy, you know, you see some timing when you do this stuff, and it's like, whoa. But I do feel that the SAR scanning is finding, and it's going to lead to that Pyramid X Hall of Records when we're ready for it. You know, at least right now, they're starting to see what's underneath there is much more extensive than anything that has ever been talked about in history. And you can't have a civilization from, you know, 3000 BC making that stuff. So you've got, you know, you have to go a lot further back. And Casey, you know, there he's saying, well, it's 10,490 BC to 10,390 BC. That's how they made the Great Pyramid. So, you know, we're starting to adjust now. If you look at the archaeoastronomy, what was going on in that period, you get the Sphinx looking out at Leo. Gee, that makes sense. You know, it's a lion's body after all. there's a lot of things that really do it. And one of the most fascinating things about the Giza Plateau, in my opinion, is the fact that Cayce was saying, look, when Rata and Hermes were looking for a spot to put the Atlantean Hall of Records, they were doing archaeology there at the Giza Plateau. That's how old it is. They were doing archaeology in 10,500 BC. So it's a much older spot than that. And we have it only at 2,500 BC. So, hopefully the technology allows us to overcome the incredible stubbornness of the field, which is beyond ridiculous. Let's see. James M. It's great to see you. Brian Whitaker, Roger Z, Short Order Cook. Oh, wow. Just fantastic. And it's great to have so many of you out there. We will see you all next week. And of course, we might have a special report if all hell breaks loose, but hopefully we will have good news. And of course, incredible episodes coming up for you later this month and in July. And, it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really ends.
It never really ends. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We will see you all next week. And never let it be forgot that once there was a Camelot. And, these guys were in some pretty tight spots and saved the whole world. So let's think of it that way. We got lucky, shall we say. Have a great weekend, everyone.
God bless everybody.